your dollar's lost 75% of its value with 3% inflation. Sorry. So the Fed's trying to get to do it. But the problem is that inflation was 3%. Now, just to be clear, when I say inflation, I'm talking about...
In this interview, Jim Rickards discusses the significant impact of inflation on the purchasing power of the dollar throughout an individual's life, from birth to mid-career. He highlights how the Federal Reserve's focus on core inflation, excluding essential expenses like food and energy, is disconnected from the reality of everyday Americans. Despite the Fed's target of 2% inflation, Rickards argues that recent data shows inflation rates surpassing this target, suggesting that the Fed has not effectively addressed the issue. He predicts that the Fed is unlikely to raise interest rates in upcoming meetings, citing both economic and political factors, particularly the proximity of the next meeting to the presidential election. Overall, Rickards suggests that the Fed's response to inflation will be cautious and influenced by various external factors, potentially delaying rate hikes until after the election.
So from birth to going off to college, your dollar's worth half. And by the time you get mid-career, you're 36 years old, half again. So 3% inflation is not benign. It actually really it takes a whack at. Sorry, I said 18 years. I meant to say 22 years, but the point's the same. In a relatively short period of time, from birth to mid-career, your dollar's lost 75% of its value with 3% inflation. Sorry. So the Fed's trying to get to do it. But the problem is that inflation was 3%. Now, just to be clear, when I say inflation, I'm talking about headline CPI, Consumer Price Index, headline inflation, 3%. And immediately, the Wall Street crowd will jump up out of their seats. Oh, Jim, we have core inflation. We take out gas and we take out energy and food prices. We're looking at core inflation. Say, well, you may be looking at core inflation, but everyday Americans are not. Gas at the pump and food at the supermarket is about like 2/3 of most people's budget. It's what they spend, other than housing and home heating. It's what they spend most of their money on. So you can't just pull out the things you don't like and say, let's look at the core. Well, you can look at it, but everyday Americans are not. They're looking at gas prices and eggs and butter and milk and everything else they buy at the supermarket. So I use headline core because that's what Americans use. And if you want to understand the political aspects of this, or how people are going to vote in November, or what the Fed should really be worried about, that's the number. And then they came up with something. These are basically people who don't have enough to do. So once they got core, they took out food and energy. Oh, don't count that. Then they took out housing, and they called it super core. I'm not making this up. This is all in the literature. You can just Google super core. You'll see what I mean. So it's like, oh, okay, I get it. You took out energy, food, and housing. And to get to what you think is relevant. Okay, you're so detached from everyday Americans. You're so detached from the real, what real people are paying for, the things they need, that no wonder they get everything else wrong. So I'm talking about headline CPI. But here's my point. Headline CPI was 3% in, so we're in March, 3% in about 6 months ago. Right now, it's 3.2. It's higher than it was 6 months ago. Now, it fluctuated in the meantime. It got as high as 3.7. It got down to 3.1, back up to 3.2, et cetera. I'm not saying inflation is going to 20%. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is it's not going to 2%. It's not going to the Fed's target. And it is not mission accomplished. The Fed has not solved the inflation problem, and they're still doing it. So they're nowhere near ready to cut rates, number one. Number two, the Fed does not do anything quickly, only in an emergency. And I mean a complete financial meltdown of the kind, I lived through in 1998 with long-term capital management. We almost took down the world, came very close. But there the Fed had cut rates at a scheduled meeting and then cut them again 2 weeks later at an unscheduled meeting. The Fed can have an emergency meeting they have an executive committee. They can act between scheduled dates, and they did in that case. And they lowered the rates again just to kind of put. And then the market said, okay, I guess they're serious. Now we will start to normalize. So, but that's very unusual. Normally they not only stick to their schedule, but they want to see 3 or 4 months worth of good data. Not 1 month, not one good month. Oh, gee, unemployment went down, inflation went down, let's cut rates. No, they want that because that could be an anomaly. Sometimes it is. They want to see 3 or 4 months in a row. They haven't had that. It just went up in the most recent month. CPI and PPI, which were just released, not long, just in the last few days, both went up. Now, again, I'm not talking 10%. I'm not talking 5%. I'm saying wrong direction. And if you're the Fed, there's no way you want to cut rates at this point. So I can already tell you what they're going to do in March. They're not going to do anything. Okay. What's interesting about that is that Jay Powell, at the end, it was I think it was January 31st was the last meeting. He did something I've never seen him do or any Fed chairman do. He said, we're not going to raise rates in March. They never do that. What they say is, we're leaning this way, but we're data dependent. We want to see more data. It could go this way, it could go that way, but kind of they'll hint that they're going to fade one way or the other, maybe raise rates. It's the no drama Fed. They don't want any shocks. But I was shocked that he said, we're not raising rates in March. And so, okay, that's an easy one. So then they have meetings in, I don't have the calendar in front of me, but I think it's May, June, July. Or if it's not May, it's the end of April. But there are 3 more meetings, and then no meeting in August, and then a meeting in September. Okay, so based on what I said, we know they're not going to raise rates in March. They're not going to raise them. I believe June is the next meeting. They're not going to raise them in June. July, maybe. Although Wall Street's betting June, but we'll see. Maybe July, but I kind of doubt it. Now, what about September? Well, on November 5th, we have a presidential election. And everyone says the Fed's not political. That's nonsense. They're one of the most political institutions you'll ever find. They do a very good job of pretending they're not political. They keep politics out of the FOMC statement. They keep politics out of the press conference. And they say we're not political. They are highly political. They look at the same things we're looking at. Do they, so the September meeting is kind of mid to late September. The election is November 5th. You're talking 6 weeks ahead of the election. Do you think they want to cut rates 6 weeks ahead of the election? They're in the ultimate no-win situation. If inflation gets worse, they don't want to raise rates because that'll hurt Biden and favor the Republicans. They don't want to cut rates because that will tend to favor Biden. It'll give Biden a very strong talking point. So they'd kind of like to keep their heads down in September. And then the next meeting's not till after the election. Then they'll have a free hand. So could they raise rates in July? Maybe, I'm not sure, but not in March, not in June, almost certainly not in September for the political reasons I mentioned. Maybe in July, 125 basis point rate cut. But even then, they've got to see the data, and they haven't seen it yet. So I'm not ready to